Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake. Order, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year, Ukrainian Canadians, Ukrainians around the world, and the international community will mark the 75th anniversary of one of the most heinous crimes in modern history, the state-sponsored famine genocide of 1932-33 perpetrated by the Soviet regime of Joseph Stalin against the Ukrainian people. The deliberate, planned famine devised to destroy the Ukrainian nation's aspirations for a free and independent Ukraine, and it killed 7 to 10 million Ukrainians. For decades, the truth about this horrific crime was suppressed by Soviet authorities. Canada has a long-standing history of condemning all war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocides. That is why today we are debating an act to establish a Ukrainian Genocide Holodomor and Famine Memorial Day. This bill not only designates the fourth Saturday of November as a Memorial Day for the Ukrainian famine, but also acknowledges the famine as an act of genocide. Across Canada right now, Holodomor activities are taking place, largely sponsored by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and its membership organizations. They're doing things such as holding memorials in a number of cities. Just right now, there is the International Remembrance Flame Tour being carried by Stefan Horlash, who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of weeks ago. Stefan is a survivor of the Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine that was imposed upon him as a small child by Stalin. Stefan has some recollections of that horrific experience that he had, and is sharing that story as he travels across Canada, carrying the international flame, talking about all the problems that he endured as a child, and of course in his journey to get out of the Soviet Union. Mr. Speaker, I've been working on this bill for about 16 months, and I know that there's many members in this House that have brought forward these types of bills in the past and in this current Parliament that feel quite strongly that this is the right issue to jump on board with. I have to thank Senator Raynell Andrechuk, who made sure that they brought forward a motion like this at the 70th anniversary back in 2003 and had a motion in the Senate where they discussed recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide. Unanimous. I also want to thank the Secretary of State for Multiculturalism for his encouragement and help in drafting this bill. I need to thank the Canadian Friends of Ukraine, who have worked tirelessly to not only raise awareness of the Holodomor, but helped in drafting my legislation over a year ago. I got to especially thank Ms. Lisa Shimko, who's the Executive Director, and Mrs. Margaret Shipra, who is the First Vice President. And as I said, there's many other MPs in here that, in all parties, that know that this is an issue that needs to be recognized, that one that all Canadians need to be better educated on, as well as making that recognition around the world. The Canadian-Ukrainian Parliamentary Friendship Association that so many of us are members of also want to make sure that we proceed in a nonpartisan and timely manner in getting this legislation through the House, and so that we recognize it in time before the 75th anniversary actually runs out. Now, I understand we need to make an amendment to my bill. I'm encouraging that we do this at committee because when I first drafted the bill, the one word I actually did leave out was Holodomor, which is a Ukrainian term, and I'm a Ukrainian heritage, but I thought for Canadian purposes, we often just refer to it as the Ukrainian famine, and I want to definitely use the word genocide in the bill. But we need to put the word Holodomor into the bill in about 5 or 6 different locations, and the best place to do that is at committee, and I'm asking my fellow members in the House to take it to committee and make those amendments there. Holodomor, although it's a Ukrainian word and it recognizes the famine of 32-33, it's based upon 2 Ukrainian words. Holod, which stands for hunger, starvation, or famine, or mort, which is to induce suffering, to kill, to die, and those 2 words together make the root for Holodomor. We need to put this in perspective. We're talking 7 to 10 million Ukrainians who died over the fall of 1932 and most of 1933. And at the peak, there was over 25,000 people a day that were being hauled out of the villages and off the farms and just thrown on wagons and taken out back and buried in mass graves. And the only way you could really look at this is you know that about that time, we're not sure what the statistics were, like solidly what the population of Ukraine was. We know that the last solid census that was taken is about 1926, 1927 by the Soviet regime. And they said there was roughly around 28, 29 million Ukrainians at that time. By just taking normal population growth, some of the statistics I saw that 1931, the population of Ukraine would have been about 31.2 million people, which is about the same population that we have here in Canada. And they kill over 7 million Ukrainians, up as high as 10 million Ukrainians if we ever could get our hands on the solid statistics of what happened during 32 and 33. It'd be like taking modern today in Canada and going to Manitoba, where I'm from, and just saying, you know, even though the prairie region grows a pile of food, we're just going to take all that food away from you, despite having a great harvest. We don't like you people for whatever reason, and just taking all that food and dumping it into Lake Winnipeg and starving out the entire population of Manitoba. But let's not stop there. If we're going to make a real comparison to what happened in the Ukraine, let's go to Saskatchewan and take all their food, take it right off the farms and out of the houses, and take that and dump it into Lake Winnipeg and let those people starve to death. But we can't stop there. We have to also go into Alberta and take all the food, all the grain, all the livestock, and take them and throw all that into the lake and let those people starve to death. But that's not it. You also have to go to BC and starve all those people right to death to have the same situation that the Ukrainian people lived through under Joseph Stalin in 1932 to 1933. Shame. It's horrific. And we have to make sure that the Ukrainians, the 7 to 10 million Ukrainians that died at the hands of the authorities of Joseph Stalin, have to be remembered. They severely punished anyone who resisted them. And this was, you know, in addition to starving and killing a number of the agents by the state, there was cannibalism. We know that occurred. There's many suicides and mercy killings, which just kept adding to the death toll. By some estimates, as I said before, 25,000, I've seen numbers as high as 28,000 people at the peak of it were dying every day. Now, I want to thank Leo Ledachowski, the president and CEO of Canada Ends. He produced and sponsored a great video on the Holodomor. And he talked to Canadian survivors of the Holodomor, Ukrainian Canadians across this country, and a lot of them right in Manitoba, including Mike and Sonia Kushlak from Selkirk in my riding. And the stories that they have, the stories that they remember growing up is just terrible. About, you know, walking down the streets and dead people laying on the streets because they didn't have the strength to walk to town. You had the horses and buggies that were coming along and picking up the dead people and just taking them out to the cemetery and putting them to mass graves. They were talking that every time that their parents tried to even bring a morsel of food home, it seemed that the activistas of the communist regime would come into their homes and find, even if it was just a sock full of wheat, and take it back and wouldn't allow them to eat. They were, you know, had their confiscation of all their crops. They had a bountiful harvest in the fall of 32. All their root crops, all their vegetables, all the wheat that they had grown, all their livestock were confiscated and taken away, their cows, their sheep, their goats, their pigs. They had absolutely nothing left. And essentially were made to suffer a great, horrible death. They were essentially, what was happening is the commitment of genocide. And I just want to read to you Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And it defines it as follows. In the present convention, this is 1948 when this was drafted, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group. 2 is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. That's exactly what happened in Ukraine. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children to the group to another group. So definitely in part C of the definition, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now we know that the famine was not caused by drought or other environmental causes. There's plenty of records to show that there was a bountiful harvest, that exports of wheat from Ukraine and from Russia were flowing into Western Europe. There's plenty of grain to go around. The carryover stocks of the Soviet Union of grain supplies would have been more than enough to feed the starving Ukrainians. We know that this was caused by the policies and the actions of Joseph Stalin's Soviet authorization aimed at the forced collectivization of agriculture and achieving the maximum extraction of agriculture produce from the rural population. Now, these policies and actions included decrees that were laying down grain procurement targets for Ukraine and ordering that all collective farm property, such as cattle and grain, should henceforth be considered state property, sacred and inviolable. Those guilty offenses against it were considered enemies of the people, to be shot unless they were extenuating circumstances, when the penalty must be imprisonment with confiscation of property. And that's a direct quote from one of the policies that Stalin had brought forth. So severe enforcement measures including death sentences numbering in the thousands, imprisonment in concentration camps, and withholding of food rations and other supplies. Now, we always think of this in the term that this was based upon the collectivization of agriculture across the Soviet Union. But it was different in the Ukraine. It was different for a number of reasons. First of all, Mr. Speaker, as well as forcing collectivization upon the Ukrainians and people of the Volga River District and Kazakhstan and the Cuban area of Russia, the Ukrainian people were unfairly targeted. They weren't allowed to migrate within their own areas. They weren't allowed to travel. There's blockades that were put in place to prevent the people of northern Ukraine from going to Russia where the food was and be able to buy it at the stores, essentially forcing them to live in these starvation ghettos, these famine ghettos. We know that the other areas, that there was still the freedom of movement, that people could move around and go and find foodstuffs. We also know that they weren't just targeting the farmers. They weren't going after the peasants. And sure, it looked like they're going after the farming community across the Soviet Union, but what they were trying to do in Ukraine, you got to remember that 80% of the population at that time were peasant farmers. They were living on the land. And essentially, they were the basis of Ukrainian pride. They were nationalists. They wanted to see again a free and independent Ukraine, as Ukraine has often cried out for. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, they were being squashed by Stalin himself and his thugs. And so anyone that was considered a nationalist, and most of them were peasants, but there was plenty within communities as well, were often hauled out and put in front of firing squads. Or they're thrown on the train and sent off to concentration camps in Siberia. Some of the numbers I've seen is that over 250,000 Ukrainians were moved out to Siberia in concentration camps. So they were trying to kill the Ukrainian national movement and the Ukrainian culture. The senior leadership of the Soviet Union, including Stalin, was directly involved in the development and implementation of these policies. The leadership under Joseph Stalin was apparently fully aware of their impact on the Ukrainian population, but nevertheless mandated actions which worsened the situation and maximized the loss of life in 1932 to 33. While these elements are widely acknowledged as historical facts, the debate about whether the Holodomor was an act of genocide defined as the deliberate and systematic destruction of a radical political or cultural group, racial group, continues at the political level, and it has not been conclusively resolved by the international academic research. But as I said, we know for a fact that there was these starvation ghettos. We know that anyone that considered themselves a Ukrainian nationalist was exterminated. We know that they tried to eradicate the culture by moving people to Siberia or by having this whole inflow of immigrants into the area to drown it out. So why now, Mr. Speaker? It's the 75th anniversary. The Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko, is coming to Canada also to talk about the Holodomor. He's promoting having a UN resolution carried to recognize it as a genocide. And there's many other countries that have declared it. But I want to thank all the MPs who are supporting this. the Canadian Friends of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And you know, we need to correct history. I'm calling upon historians, journalists, educators to record and include the facts of this horrible genocide so that all Canadians can learn from this tragic piece of Ukrainian history. Vichnaya Yam Payet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions or comments? Questions or comments? The honourable member for